Hey there, this is Matt O'Leary, and we've got volume 2 of the eventual 4-part Djesse album from English super genius Jacob Collier. Jazz, folk, funk, soul, a cappella, you name it. In this age of almost endless information, we've got leagues, we've got scores of autodidacts sitting at home and replacing their post-secondary education with YouTube. There was bound to be someone, some beautiful soul who took that self-education to its logical endpoint, which is, as far as we know, like I said, endless. I mean, we do not know the limits, the boundaries of our capacities, of our brains as humans, just because, you know, the unknown, the undiscovered is just that. And in music today, that anomaly, that person who pushes our potential as far and farther than anyone else, basically, is Jacob Collier. I have no qualms whatsoever saying this guy is one of the most impressive humans in the world today. He could play almost any instrument. His voice sounds like the choral setting on a keyboard that sounds like you're in some resonant cavern in South America or something. And he's kind of mastered music theory and arrangement and composition and production and performance. When there's someone who's just far and away more talented, more genius than almost anyone, you know, that ideal acts as a judge. That talent, that beauty, that whatever it is, it acts as a judge because it has a way of just highlighting everything else that's kind of ugly and dingy and undeveloped by contrast. You know, when you go to a museum and see a beautiful painting, you're just kind of reminded of the rest of the world that's like but to fend against the entropy and the suffering of the world, we need that beauty. We need art. Jacob Collier is the man that simultaneously makes you feel weak and pathetic and untalented. But we're a lot better off for him being here. But I will say, with the 2 albums he's put out so far, I feel like, in my opinion, he's yet to put out something that really stands apart and amounts to something that is more than the sum of its parts. What I mean by that, if I can explain this, is when I'm listening to Djesse Volume 1, when I'm listening to that album, I'm continually reminded of the artist, but stolen away from the art. I end up thinking, wow, that Jacob Collier guy is talented and amazing. Not that this album itself is amazing. You know, I said this on the channel, but I think In My Room from 2016 is probably the closer he's come of these 2 records he's made so far to something that has transcendent value on its own, that is independent of his technical skills. But I find that when I do return to that one, it's not really the whole thing. It's really just the originals and a few tracks here and there. Sorry for that long wind-up, but I feel like it was kind of necessary just to give this thing some context. Djesse Volume 2, this one, is supposed to be the acoustic, the more intimate album compared to the very grand orchestral Volume 1. So we get a totally new musical landscape here, supposedly. There's still those classic Jacob Collier upbeat, you know, blissfully positive tracks like It Don't Matter featuring JoJo, which kind of bops along with a funky bass line and culminates with those EDM bass drops that he loves so much and some glitzy vocal runs. Nebeluyo is a very stylistically different track, but I think does something similar with its dynamic flow through the whole thing. It features what sounds like a West African vocalist. It has that same trajectory that Jacob uses so often, where it starts so softly, so subtly, and then just grows and grows, more chaotic as it goes along in a very linear fashion. The guitar shredder Steve Vai is also on this album. He just calls him up on the phone and brings him in, and Vai's on 2 tracks near the end of the album, Do You Feel Love and then Outro, which are kind of the oddballs, kind of the Flintstones of this album, with again these very glamorous sound effects, and Vai's guitar is just kind of patched in there with no discernible or recognizable melody or sequence. Or there are times when Collier's sound is so self-indulgent that it sounds like an overblended palette of paint, just kind of a muddy brown. These 2 Steve Vai songs are 2 really bizarre experiments that don't connect to the mood or the tone in my mind at all of the rest of the album. In fact, the whole second half is kind of strange. It really does not mesh. Then there's Here Comes the Sun, which is cleverly reharmonized in the way that Jacob loves to do with his covers, in a way that doesn't betray the melody, the perfect melody in that song. But there's so many good Beatles songs, and I feel like it's a bit of a predictable cover, especially for Jacob. It's honestly and unfortunately the thing that makes a lot of Collier's music to me feel a little bit kitschy. Mainly because these songs feel like they're mostly about creating the craziest, densest, most ambitious arrangement instead of the tone and the mood of the album itself or any sort of self-expression. The closer is such a breath of fresh air for me, Time to Rest Your Weary Head, which returns to the more subtle, quiet style of the first half of the album. If it feels like I'm being kind of a downer on this album or just way too critical or something, it's only because of how much I believe Jacob's capable of. But what I feel might be the necessary trade-off of such incredible enthusiasm and optimism about life and about music and such amazing talent is just these very poorly curated and hodgepodge-like collections of tracks with no discernible theme or through line. There's kind of a technical problem there that's hindering him. You know, he's got just so much at his disposal. He's got instruments lining the walls. He's got knowledge more than any of us could hope for. He's got such a giddy love and affection for harmony, you know, that he just sometimes cannot restrain himself. He ends up making something that's a lot more obnoxious than artful. The Moon River cover on this album is kind of like that for me. You know, he's doing such innovative stuff. It's really mind-boggling from a theory perspective. But it doesn't feel like it belongs on an intimate folk album. I mean, think of the contrast of like Nick Drake's albums, like Pink Moon. Jacob's obviously going for something a lot greater in scope, but there's just something about that limitation, something about that cohesiveness, that consistency that makes something that endures a lot longer than I think this album will. All of that being said, and it's a lot, I'd be remiss to not mention the great stuff on this album. There are still some really gorgeous songs that rival his most beautiful, In the Real Early Morning, that song with his mom on the last album, or Ocean Wide Canyon Deep. The songs here, Sky Above and Make Me Cry, are stunning in their simplicity. The song Feel is a neo-soul banger featuring Liana La Havas, and Lua just struts some equally sparse bossa nova flair. These two tracks are very simplistic, you know, lacking the stacks of harmony on every note, and I think all the better because of it. It's really hard to give this a score because, again, Jacob is almost too good for words. But again, it's the curation, it's the album flow, it just feels too erratic for me again, and unfortunately it's a 6. But there's some hope that the next one will be a little bit more focused, a little more condensed, because this album's 16 tracks and the whole thing in 4 parts is supposed to be 40. So I wasn't head over heels for it, but I'm always going to recommend Jacob's music just because the musicianship is first rate and you're going to find little bits and pieces of pure excellence. So go out and buy it and let me know if you have some totally different opinion than this. As always, thank you so much for watching.